This is Free to Exchange, the show where free markets and free-thinking scholars meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Economics is everywhere. If you've been watching this show the last 6 seasons, you already know that economics is not just about stock markets or dollars and cents, but that instead economic reasoning can be used to better understand all sorts of topics. Today I have with me a master of the economic way of thinking, who has a knack for finding counterintuitive conclusions by applying economic reasoning in a wide variety of situations. My guest today is Dr. Stephen Landsburg. Dr. Landsburg is a professor of economics at the University of Rochester. He's the author of 8 books, including The Armchair Economist, More Sex is Safer Sex, and most recently, Can You Outsmart an Economist? Steve, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me here.
So today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to, instead of sticking with one topic, we're going to just kind of use the economic way of thinking to shed light on a whole bunch of different topics, kind of rapid fire here maybe, following through some of the books that you've worked on. So let's start out with one. I got a new car for my wife recently. It's got all of these safety features and airbags everywhere and bells and whistles that tell you when people are around you. But the first chapter of your old book, The Armchair Economist, is called How Seatbelts Kill. What's the logic here?
The logic is very simple. It's the logic of incentives. When your car has more safety features, it is easier to survive an accident. You're less likely to be injured, you're less likely to be killed, and that means you're more willing to take a chance of having an accident. It means people drive more recklessly. Essentially, you've driven down the price of reckless driving. The part of the price of reckless driving is that you might get killed. You've driven down that price, and when you drive down the price of something, people demand more of it.
But my wife doesn't go around saying, I want to go reckless drive. She doesn't want to have an accident.
No, she doesn't say it out loud, and she doesn't maybe acknowledge it. But the fact of the matter is that if I took the doors off your wife's car, she would probably drive a whole lot more carefully. If I make your car more dangerous, and this is a very interesting fact about the way people respond to this. If I tell people that when cars are made safer, people drive more recklessly, they find that hard to believe. They react, they say, oh, that's just doesn't sound right. And yet, if I tell people that if I made your car more dangerous, you would drive more carefully, everybody believes that. And it's exactly the same thing, just said in a different way. If I were to mount a spear on your steering wheel pointed directly at your heart, I guarantee you would do less tailgating. In the opposite direction, when I give you a padded dashboard, a shatterproof windshield, seat belts, safety belts, traction control, all of those things, we see in the data that people do drive more recklessly. They do have more accidents. As it turns out, they die at roughly the same rate they were dying at before. They're safer because of the safety devices, but they're also having more accidents. And
so fewer deaths per accident.
Fewer deaths per accident, more accidents. Either of those effects could have been larger than the other, but when you actually look at the data, you find that they roughly cancel each other out.
Now, I totally appreciate this because part of the year I drive an old 1979 car, and I know when I get on the highway, I'm much more careful in that than with my modern one. But that's because I'm thinking about me. What are the third-party effects with this?
Well, the third parties, the pedestrians and the other people you meet on the road, the pedestrians don't have seatbelts. The pedestrians don't have padded dashboards. The pedestrians don't have all those safety features. And so, in fact, we see that as cars are made safer, pedestrian deaths actually rise. And we see this not just on the streets, but also on the NASCAR tracks, where we've got a lot of data. It's a wonderful thing because NASCAR is constantly, hundreds of times per year, instituting new little safety improvements that are made mandatory for the drivers. And we see that in the data that every time the cars are made safer, every time the safety features come in, drivers drive a little more faster and they drive around those tracks and they have more accidents. And we have a lot more injuries among the pit crews.
And profits go up, I bet.
And profits go up because those accidents are exactly what people come to NASCAR to see.
So in evaluating things, economists of cost weigh costs and benefits. So someone listening to you could hear, okay, so as safety improvements, we get more accidents, some extra pedestrian deaths, about the same. Are they good or bad on net, the safety improvements?
A lot of times I tell my students about seatbelts, and a lot of times they walk out of class with the false impression that I learned in class today that seatbelts do no good. That's not true. When you get a seatbelt, if you drive faster and still have the same risk of dying as you had before, you've gotten a benefit out of that. People like to drive fast. The seatbelts are definitely making people better off, making drivers better off. I'm not so sure about the pedestrians, but they're making drivers better off. They are taking that benefit in a form perhaps that you did not expect them to take it in, but a person who is driving faster, having the benefits of getting where they're going faster, and at no increased risk of dying is a person you've done some good for.
All right. So let's move on to another topic. So most people probably haven't thought about that one before, but a lot of people have thought about environmentalism and recycling and things like that before, but probably haven't thought about it like an economist. The last chapter in one of your books is called something like The Science of Economics versus the Religion of Ecology. What would you like to tell us about how the economic way of thinking kind of impacts thinking about the environment and recycling?
What I would like people to be aware of is that the issues that we think of as environmental issues are always issues about conflicts between people who want to use the same resource for two different things. There's a patch of land and somebody wants to use it as a forest preserve and somebody else wants to use it as a parking lot. When people have different preferences about the use of a resource, that's a problem. And we have to figure out ways to solve those problems. We have to figure out ways to compromise. We have to figure out ways to make decisions without killing each other. But there is not a moral aspect to having one preference over the other. If you like rabbits and squirrels and I like a place to park my car, your preferences are impinging on mine, my preferences are impinging on yours. It would be better if they didn't impinge on each other, but they do. We have to work that out. And I think that trying to paint one side or the other as evil in these things, as happens so often in public discourse, is just not productive. It is not, it does not address any of the issues that we really need to address there.
So I understand that about conflicting uses of resources, but some will say it's just uncontroversial. Everybody should do, and I get this from my kid at school sometimes, and I know you've suffered with that too. Everybody should recycle. Recycling is good.
Recycling is expensive in many ways. Not just the process itself, but the time and the energy and the thought that goes into sorting your materials into different. I go into a restaurant and they've got 6 different kinds of trash cans and I'm trying to figure out what kind of trash goes in which can. It's an annoyance. It's a minor annoyance, but it's an annoyance. And maybe if I were to take care to make sure everything went in the right can, I would do a minor amount of good for the environment. I'm not sure whether the annoyance is worth that or not, and I think it's okay for different people to make that choice in different ways.
Sure, and in fact, in some things, someone say we need to recycle paper to save the trees. Does this make economic sense when we think of incentives?
Actually, it doesn't, because if you think about why people plant trees, they plant trees in order to cut them down. Most new forest growth is coming from things like paper companies, which are planting trees in order to cut them down. If you start recycling paper, there's going to be less demand for paper. That means fewer trees are going to be planted. And there is no reason to think that recycling paper will raise the size of forests. If anything, it will shrink the size of forests. Just as if everyone were to stop eating meat, the size of the cattle herds would go down. You don't stop eating meat in order to make there be more cows in the world. If we stopped eating meat, people would stop raising cows.
And in fact, the great cow emancipation wouldn't work out very well for the existing cows.
Probably not. Probably not.
So switching modes once again to another one of these topics where it's, because you're thinking about the trees example, where it's not just incentives, we're thinking about secondary consequences and how people's behavior reacts. You have a section in the More Sex is Safer Sex book about how to read the news. And things that seem straightforward of helping people maybe aren't. And one was the response to Hurricane Katrina and bringing in federal aid for people who had chosen to live in high-risk areas in New Orleans. Enlighten me with what your thinking is on that.
If you have a policy of bailing out people who have chosen to live in high-risk areas, you're going to make land more expensive in those areas. There are people who choose those high-risk areas because those high-risk areas are cheap. People have different preferences with regarding to risk, and if there are areas that are prone to hurricanes, prone to natural disasters, one advantage of living in those places is that you can get land cheap. And some people are willing to take those risks in order to have a place that they can afford to live in. As soon as you adopt a government policy of saying that we're going to bail out everyone who lives in those places and has a disaster, the first thing you see is land prices in those places go up. Now people no longer have that option of choosing a risky place to live in order to get a lower price. You've homogenized things. You've brought land prices there up. You've brought land prices other places down. You've lowered the range of choice that's available to people, and I think it's a good thing for people to have a range of choice.
So disproportionately, then, it's going to be poor people who are hurt by such a policy.
It's poor people
probably.
who tend to make those choices. It's poor people who like to be able to have lower quality goods available at a lower price. Of course, they would prefer not to be poor, but given that they're poor, the availability of lower quality goods at a lower price is a big boon to them. And if you start forcibly raising the quality of those goods, as you do when you tie land to an agreement that the government will help people who run into trouble on that land. If you start raising the quality of those goods and simultaneously raising the prices of them, you're not doing poor people any favor.
Yeah, it's akin to almost mandating that they all buy Cadillacs instead of used cars.
Exactly. It's mandating that they buy a higher quality land than they would prefer to buy given their incomes.
And meanwhile, what does it do to the other population that's deciding not to live on the high-risk land?
Well, of course, they're paying the price, and they're paying the price for bailing other people out. So it's not clear that any large group of people are winners here. I might say also, this is tangential to your point, but I can't resist mentioning it when you talk about bailing people out from disasters. When we bailed people out from Hurricane Katrina, the government spent, in order to rebuild the city of New Orleans, the amount of money they spent came down to $200,000 per resident of New Orleans. That's $800,000 per family of four. Once again, a question of, I think you want to ask yourself, if you think about the poor residents of New Orleans, who are the ones we were really trying to help, did they really prefer having their city rebuilt to having cash payments of $800,000 per family? Why don't we stop and think, if we're spending that kind of money, about whether we could spend it in a better way?
I think that's a great question to ask, and we're going to ask more of them in just a minute. We're mixing it up here today. There will be no next guest. Dr. Landsburg is sticking around to explore more provocative topics with us when we return. You should stick around too.
This program is made possible in part by a grant from the Helen Jones Foundation, supporting education and the fine arts in keeping with the philosophy of Helen DeVitt Jones, who devoted her later life to sharing her wealth as a patron of philanthropic causes. The Helen Jones Foundation.
Founded in 2013, the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University promotes the teaching and study of free market economics. As part of our programming, we sponsor a public lecture series open to students, faculty, staff, and the general public in the Lubbock community. Often, the speakers in that series are the guests that you see right here on Free to Exchange. More information is available at www.fmi.ttu.edu or by email at free.market@ttu.edu. Welcome back. Still with me is Dr. Stephen Landsburg. So Steve, you wrote a book with the title, and we've got to talk about what the kind of keynote chapter of this book is. It's called More Sex is Safer Sex. This is deeply counterintuitive to most people. The idea of, if more people are having sex, won't this spread HIV and other diseases more? How does economics weigh in on this at all and come up with more sex is safer sex?
Well, you know, there are people out there who are very promiscuous and very reckless, and they've got a history of a lot of partners and not taking a lot of care. When they have more partners, they are making the world a less safe place. No question about that. And they are analogous to the people who create air pollution, not thinking about the consequences of their actions and having those consequences fall on other people. And for the same reason that the world has too much pollution, those people are having too many partners.
Because they're not accounting for the fact that their disease is going to spread.
They're not accounting for the costs that they're imposing on other people.
Okay.
But the flip side of that is that if you are a very cautious, chaste person who is very unlikely to be infected with any disease, then if you uncharacteristically go out and find a new partner tonight, you are making the partner pool safer for everybody else. You are making the world a little less polluted. The person who goes home with you is going to have safer sex than they expected. And you improve the quality of the average match in the same way that very promiscuous person is reducing the quality of the average match. So the person who, the very chaste person who occasionally takes an extra partner is sort of like an antipolluter. It's a person who cleans up the air for everyone else and makes the world a slightly safer place.
Or if it was a polluted river, they're the clean bucket of water being added.
They're the clean bucket of water being added. And that's only part of the story. The other part of the story is that when that chaste person...
Actually, before we get to the next part of the story, let's just be clear on this part. So there's somebody who is going to be promiscuous tonight. Then it's a question of who they're matched with. And adding somebody who's more personally conservative into the stream just improves the odds that they don't have a bad match.
It improves their odds that they don't have a bad match.
Okay, so that's the first part of the story.
That's the first part. Now, the second part of the story is empirically much more important, although a little more macabre. And that is that if a relatively chaste person goes out tonight and finds a new partner, that new partner might have a terrible disease. And if you are that very chaste person, you might get infected. You might go home and you might die with that disease. And that's great because we just killed the virus. The virus dies with you. If somebody's going to be infected tonight, I want it to be you and not promiscuous Pete, who's going to spread it to 20 other people before he dies. The chaste person going out there and getting infected is perhaps preventing a more promiscuous person from getting infected, and therefore is preventing 20 other people from picking up the disease from that promiscuous person. So unfortunately, you can't use this as a pickup line in a bar. You can't go into a bar and say, you should go home with me because think how wonderful it would be if I infected you with something and you died and took the virus with you. But that's the whole point. The whole point is that there is a disconnect between what's in your private interest and what's in the social interest, a theme that comes up in economics all the time. You actually do the world a service if you go out there, get the virus, and die with it. You have no incentive to go out there and do that.
I'm pretty sure there's nobody inspired at home. This is a Sunday morning show saying, you know what? I'm going to go make the world a better place tonight.
But this is exactly a theme that runs through all of economics. A lot of times people don't have the right incentives to make the world a better place, and we have to think about the consequences of that. The wonderful thing about free markets, of course, is that so often, so much more often than you might expect, they do give people exactly the right incentives. But we don't want to take that for granted, and we want to recognize that that's not always true.
Sometimes it might not be true, but it might not be obvious what a corrective is. I mean, what is a corrective in this situation?
A corrective in this situation ideally would be to subsidize chaste people to have more sex, and at the same time tax promiscuous people for having more sex. But that's very hard to do because you don't know who the chaste people are and who the promiscuous people are. You can't tell by looking. So you can toy with what would be some of the ideal correctives to this. And then even when you come up with what you think is the ideal corrective, that if you're very chaste and you find a new partner, we're going to give you $50. Even if you come up with something like that and you believe that ideally it would work, then you have to still ask yourself, do we want to give governments the power to do this kind of thing? Because once you make governments more powerful, in order for them to be able to follow good policies, you've also made them a little more powerful in ways that they might use to follow bad policies in the future. And that same thing comes up if we go back to pollution. We want governments to tax polluters. We think that's a good thing, but when we give them the power to tax, they don't always use it wisely. So we want to stop and think about that.
And they could overshoot as much as undershoot in terms of corrections. And give us an idea of the magnitude in this market, this hookup market, if you will, of the relatively chaste person. What's the numbers that would minimize disease, and is that really what government or we should be wanting anyway?
What we have based on work done by Michael Kramer, who's an economist at Harvard, who also knows a lot about epidemiology, he estimates that if you have fewer than 2.25 partners per year, and if you were to raise yourself up to 2.25 partners per year, but not go past that, you would reduce the spread of HIV.
But that's not necessarily the optimal number of partners if we're weighing both cost and benefits.
Correct. If you went to 2.25 partners, you would be lowering the cost of. You would be lowering the amount of disease. If you go a little beyond 2.25, you are perhaps raising the amount of disease a small amount, but also raising the amount of sexual pleasure people are having by so much that socially it's probably worth it. And so we would if we take account of those benefits, we probably want to bring you up a bit above 2.25 partners, not all the way to 20 partners, because we're turning you into promiscuous Pete.
The polluter.
Right.
Nothing like a little talk about the costs and benefits of sex for Sunday morning. So moving on from that topic, your latest book, Can You Outsmart an Economist, has a whole bunch of different puzzles and oddities where people's first intuition is often wrong. So let's take a couple examples from that. So one, actually, since we're sitting at Texas Tech and the university, students do evaluations of professors, and disproportionately, people who are more beautiful, more handsome, get better evaluations. Students are just shallow. That's what most people are going to think.
Absolutely. Now, in Can You Outsmart an Economist, many of the little puzzles in that book are cases where the whole moral is to think beyond the obvious. You look at the way people are behaving, it looks like they're behaving shallowly or it looks like they're behaving irrationally, but in fact, if you think about the incentives people were facing, the behavior is explained. Yes, more beautiful teachers are consistently rated more highly by their students. And yes, that looks like students are being shallow. But if you think about it, beautiful people have a lot of career options that other people don't have, not just in Hollywood, not just in modeling, but in sales, retail, anything that involves dealing with the public. Beauty is an advantage. So a beautiful person who chose to teach college is a person who, on average, gave up a lot of other opportunities in order to teach college. And on average, those are going to be people who really want to be in the classroom. They're enthusiastic about it. They're going to do better jobs. By contrast, those of us who are a little more ordinary looking, maybe some of us are in that college classroom just because it was the only option available to us. And on average, we're not going to be as good in the classroom. So, as I say in Can You Outsmart an Economist, if you show me a lighthouse keeper with movie star good looks, I will show you the world's best lighthouse keeper, because if he gave up a career in Hollywood to keep that lighthouse, he really cared about doing a good job. Beauty does not have to be a qualification for the job you're doing, as long as it's a qualification for some other job. It's going to be correlated with doing a good job. And the theme throughout Can You Outsmart an Economist is to look for the logic behind the obvious.
Right, and in this case, it's that they have a higher cost of taking that job, so they must really want that job. So another one is, maybe you can give just a quick background on the situation. In a lot of societies, boys are preferred over girls.
By parents for having children.
Right. And then when we look at adoption markets, when they adopt children, girls are chosen over boys.
People ask for, in those same societies where the parents are all eager to have sons, the adoption agencies are overwhelmed with requests for girls. Looks a little strange, looks a little maybe irrational, doesn't make sense. But if you look beyond the obvious, what's going on, if I live in one of those societies where I know all my neighbors prefer boys, and I'm looking to adopt, I know that at that adoption agency, in order for a boy to be put up for adoption, the parents have to really feel like he's a troublesome child. Maybe he's got an illness, maybe he's poorly behaved. A lot of the girls, on the other hand, at that adoption agency are there just because they're girls and the parents didn't want a girl. So if I care about having a healthy, well-behaved child, my odds are a lot better if I take a girl, even if I would have preferred a boy. I don't just prefer a boy, I also prefer healthy and well-behaved. My odds are much better if I take a girl because there are so many healthy, well-behaved girls that got put at that adoption agency just for being girls. So once again, if you think about costs and benefits, if you think about incentives, it all becomes clear.
In just for people watching, how much does this apply to the United States versus other societies around the world, do you think?
We do have some evidence from the United States that that parents prefer boys. And in fact, in my book, More Sex is Safer Sex, I presented a lot of that evidence. I have come around to believe that evidence is less convincing than I thought it was when I wrote that book. And in fact, in Can You Outsmart an Economist, which is a more recent book, I mentioned that I now find that evidence a little less convincing than I did then, but people can read both books and see the arguments both ways.
They can buy both of them. In fact, so your most recent one, where is this available?
If you go to outsmartaneconomist.com, that's all one word, the website, outsmartaneconomist.com, you can not only find out how to read the book and not only read the reviews, but you can read the first chapter for free. So if you think this might be the book for you, go to outsmartaneconomist.com, read the first chapter for free, and if you like it, the ordering information is right there on that page.
All right. Well, thank you for a provocative Sunday morning conversation, Steve.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Understanding economics is like getting a set of eyeglasses when you have blurry vision. Economic eyeglasses take a blurry, confusing world and help us better see the connections between different things and how things actually function. Today we had a guy with a great set of economic eyeglasses addressing a whole bunch of topics kind of in rapid fire. I bet you some of you raised your eyebrows while he talked about some of these. Maybe you were convinced on some, maybe not on others. Probably not on a whole bunch of them. But it's an invitation to look further into the economic way of thinking, possibly by reading some of the books that we discussed, or just exploring economics more generally, or even tuning into the next episode of this show. I'll see you next time.